pleasure to be hosting him during his first official visit to the United States. So without further ado, Mr. Kasčiūnas, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Dear Matt, thank you very much. Lithuanian Ministry of Defense is very happy to cooperate with Atlantic Council, and we are looking forward for even deeper one. So, about upcoming Washington Summit, about Russia, and about the eastern flank. So first of all, I will say a few words about Russia capabilities and potential now to challenge NATO eastern flank. I think last year we had some mood in Western strategic thinking, a little bit underestimating Russians' ability to adapt to the new situation. What we need to say, first thing, Russia put their economy on a war mode. And there are many examples when they are moving forward. For example, production of ammunition. Before a full-scale war in Ukraine, they produced 300,000-400,000 152 and other ammunition. Now we're producing 2.2 million of them. It is despite sanctions. It is despite our attempts to isolate them. So we are on the war mode. And sometimes we are hearing the questions, okay, but we cannot last long in such kind of mode. But I think sometimes we apply Western criteria, Western thinking criteria to Russia, and it's not adequate. Because we don't care about the social welfare, we don't care about any social things of society, because society is manipulated, society is socially engineered. And of course, because of authoritarian regime, first of all. So that's why, when you want to understand Russia, you should not apply the Western criteria of thinking. It's a pragmatical criteria, which is not necessary in the strategic thinking of Russia. Second thing, what we also solved, it's so-called mobilization reserve. We create a so-called mercenary army. We're paying some money for lower social strata people, citizens in Russia, and attract them to the war. And you know, 25 millions, this is a number when we ask how many mobilization reserve Russia can have. So it's 25 millions. Comparing with us, comparing with Ukraine, it's a big numbers. So this is what we need to understand. We are preparing. The problem is that when we try to tackle this challenge, we always were counting how many years we need. 3, 5, 7, you know, many interpretations, many countings. I think we should change the approach. We should build our defense and deterrence in that mode and manner, in eastern flank, in the whole NATO, to control the process. So do not count their years, but to control the process and to deter them. That's why NATO decisions is so important. And I want to say what the moves and actions and direction after Madrid, Vilnius summits, I think it's a positive one. It's a positive one. First of all, of course, new defense plans. I think it's a breakthrough. So we transformed from deterrence by punishment concept to deterrence by denial, especially after Irpin, Bucha, when you saw that after their occupation, there is nothing to take back. So we need to fight on the line. We need to be ready to fight on the line and to deter on the line. That's why we need to have a credible defense and deterrence architecture based on principle forward defense. And the plans, together with fast reinforcement, is a good direction to act. We need to tackle still the problems. As you know, capability gaps, air defense, maneuver capabilities, long strike capabilities, but little by little we are moving forward. The authorities of secure. This is very important for us, for Eastern flank, to be much more flexible responding to the possible threats and risks. The intelligence indicator shows that it's already a crisis coming. We need to react for deterrence. Not fighting for the aggression, but to deter them. That's why we need flexible decisions, flexible response. And more authority, more powers for secure is very, very important. And I would say we're also moving little by little toward this direction. We need exercises based on Article 5 with transatlantic reinforcement. I think it's also would be very important. So executability of defense plans. This is number one, what we need to do. Second point, is of course defense investment and defense production. I will not say anything now new, you know it very well. We are trying, also Europe is trying. We increased our production in ammunition about 50%. Of course, Europe is not on the war stage economy, but we are trying to find the solutions, also in Lithuania, also in Europe. We agreed in Vilnius that 2% is only the floor for defense spending, and we should try to transform the money into the capabilities. How to do it in a faster way? It's still a big challenge, because even now, if you have contract somewhere for the ammunition, for the weapons, even if you have the money now, it comes in 4 years. It's not like in Russia, as we know. So we have improved in this direction. One representative of one military industry in Europe said to me, we in Europe not producing, we are manufacturing. It's a little bit different way of doing it when it's our adversaries are doing. So of course, defense industrial base. We should improve here as much as possible. Talking about defense architecture, I should mention, I think, very important decision made by Germany in Lithuania. Brigade in place, which we agreed with Germany on a roadmap, implementing step by step. I think it's a role model for our Eastern flank countries, what kind of forward defense architecture we should build in Eastern flank. And, but of course, it works only with United States of America in Europe and Eastern flank. So that's why when we are doing it with Germany, the same, your presence, heel-to-toe model, rotational, persistent but rotational model of your troops in Baltics, in Lithuania, is vital for us. It's a vital factor of deterrence. I can say even one joke. When I was a chair of Defense Committee, we also have many formats, Nordic Baltics, and we met one senior expert analyst and some generals from Western countries. And when my colleague from Nordic countries, he liked such kind of questions: who is stronger, like a tiger or something, or leopard or something like that? And he asked, "Tell me, which army in Europe is the strongest one?" And the general said, "American." No. In Europe, we know what America is the strongest. No, he said, America. So even in Europe, American forces is the strongest forces. So that's why America is so vital for European security. But of course, as we see, Europe also investing into defense, taking responsibility, taking actions is also important. And I think Germany is doing a great job in Eastern flank. Third point, air defense. We need to create the integrated system. We know very well that air defense capabilities have a biggest deficit in NATO. So producing the air defense, long range, medium range, short range, it's a vital. That's why now we in Lithuania also a little bit shifting our priorities, I would say. We're trying to make our Lithuanian division heavier creating the tank battalion step by step, but also investing more into the middle-range air defense systems, which could help to defend not only our armies, but also our citizens in the cities, as we see in Ukraine, how it is vital. Fourth thing, thinking about the deterrence and defense architecture, is of course Ukraine. It's Ukrainian Euro-Atlantic aspirations. We know very well Ukrainians are fighting not only for themselves, they are fighting for Europe. And we are just asking for weapons and ammunition, you know? We do not ask for troops. So give them tools to fight with empire and to control and to contain the empire. It's so simple. It looks like if you do not send the troops somewhere defending the NATO country, it's the most cheapest way to give weapons and ammunition to Ukraine. Simple as that. It's not simple in political situation as we see. When we're talking about NATO and Ukrainian relations, I know it's difficult. Lithuania will stand always for invitation. But at the same time, we should not give to Russia informal veto power on NATO enlargement. No third country should have such kind of blocking right. That's when our decision in Washington should be also based on that assumption. Fifth point, it's NATO and Indo-Pacific. I think the trends, processes, and the situations are interconnected. And I think we should also do more in closer cooperation between two regions, especially thinking how to contain and control the authoritarian regimes, which are interconnection between themselves, as we know very well. So these are the main 5 points. And for the last thing, but also, I would say, important one, I would want to a little bit to talk about this puzzle which called escalation, de-escalation thinking. I know it sometimes very much restricts some moves, especially in the NATO, when we are thinking about support to Ukraine. And, you know, doing nothing is escalatory. We should put in mind it, because it's Russia. If you will just, you know, think that you will not do anything, we will, you know, consider it as you as a peaceful, no. We will take and break you. We respect only if you're strong. Very simple thing. Peace through strength. You know it very well. Classical things. So that's why we need to escape from this dilemma of escalatory, de-escalatory, which Russia is always trying to play with us. And that's why we need active defense. Sometimes even creating for Russia also dilemmas. Not only their dilemmas for us, but our dilemmas for them. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those thoughtful comments, Mr. Kostyunas. And I believe I know you have a busy schedule, but I think we have time for at least a few questions. Sure. And so I wanted to start with the threat environment, because I think some in the United States might say, well, Russia turned out to be weaker than we thought. It has its hands full in Ukraine. Putin's not foolish enough to attack a NATO ally anytime soon. But you're right there on the front lines. So can you share with us what are the realities of the security situation on NATO's eastern flank and the Russian threat?
Several factors. Yeah, if you look at Kaliningrad now, there are even less capabilities than it was before the war, because it's delivered to Ukraine, you know. But at the same time, we know that these forces and capabilities could be reinforced very fast, very fast. You know, Shoigu, he presented a new reform in army reform, especially in western direction, on western district in 22 December, to transform the brigades into division level. And if you look at their capabilities to do it in personnel level, they can do it very fast. Their war industry also is capable, maybe not very much technological sophisticated, but you know, to contribute the technical equipment for that kind of building that kind of a new architecture. That's why it's where we can do it very fast. It's, as an authoritarian country, we can do it very fast. That's why we should adapt. And the best adaptation is, of course, defense and deterrence architecture, which I talked a little bit. Another important factor is Belarus. We don't see Belarus as an independent country. It's already integrated in all that kind of domains of Russia, especially in military terms. And also, I remember one conversation with some Ukrainians, but it was before the war. In 2014, one of the key Ukrainians was also, at that time, was ideas that Russia can use Belarus also after Maidan to attack. He went to Lukashenko saying, President, could you give me a guarantee that Russia will not use your territory? He said officially, yes, of course, we are an independent state. In the evening, after some drinks, he asked the same question, and he told him, I will inform you in 48 hours if they go. It was in 2014. I don't know how much hours now he has. I think nothing. That's why we do not see them as an independent country, and it's also an important factor. So, but of course, if you look, another special problem could be no notice or short notice scenarios. So if you talk about conventional threats, conventional divisional war, so of course intelligence, we have good capabilities for yearly warning system. But for no notice or short notice scenarios, something hybrid things below Article number 5, we should also be prepared for that kind of things. And as you know, we already survived one of the attacks. It was so-called instrumentalized migration, when Lukashenko pushed people through our borders, and we need to adapt to that situation. So such kind of scenarios also could be various, and we need to be ready for that.
That makes sense, and you talked about the need then to have the proper defense and deterrence architecture. As you know, at the Vilnius Summit last year, these new regional plans were agreed to, kind of the first serious NATO defense plans, arguably since the end of the Cold War. But there have been some public reporting that we don't yet have the capabilities that we need for these plans. Do we have what we need to defend NATO's eastern flank? And if not, what are the biggest gaps in your view?
I think we have, but we have some gaps, as you said. So that's why, of course, air defense, heavier divisions, so it's tanks, artillery systems, deep strike capabilities. I think we have a list of so-called gaps, but the gaps which we can control. I mean, if we are moving forward defense with a new energy, I think we can find the solutions. But here is the most important thing, America and Europe. Without America, security of Europe is impossible. That's why we are doing ourselves. We know what we should invest in our defense, and we are doing, our aim is 3%. We see in the Baltics 3% as a floor, not a 2. In the Baltics, we see as a 3% as a floor. And we will achieve, I think, this year. So that's why we are doing a lot of things. Total defense also included. But at the same time, we sending the message to the United States, we need you also. So that's why presence of United States in Europe is biggest and most credible deterrence factor.
Good. Well, I've had the opportunity to visit Lithuania and meet with the American and German commanders on the ground there, and I think that is really
powerful
to have that visible manifestation of American power there on the ground. Yeah. So a big summit coming up, 75th anniversary of NATO. People are debating what should the priorities be. From Lithuania's point of view, what are the major priorities for the summit? What would you like to see as the main deliverables coming out of the summit?
Executability of the defense plans, filling the gaps, air defense. We have this called air defense rotational model, but because of deficit in NATO, we need to mobilize a little more resources into that, and of course Ukraine.
Yes. Can you say more? Of course, Ukraine. What would you like to see?
Invitation. Of course, invitation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I have many more questions, but looking at the clock, I think we've come to the end of our time. And any brief thoughts you'd like to leave with the audience?
just to thank you and thank United States for, in historical terms, for us, for our nation, America, and helping in our freedom fighting in every stage of our history was so crucial. And that's why if you ask Lithuanians which country always was the most closest to Lithuania in historical terms, supporting our independence, statehood, is the United States. And that's why Lithuania is so transatlantic. So keep your transatlantic bonds, and we will be safe Western civilization together. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thanks also to Lithuania. And as you know, burden sharing is becoming a political issue in the United States.
Yeah.
And so it's great to see allies like Lithuania that are more than pulling their weight. But thank you very much, Minister Kasčiūnas, for taking the time with us this morning. We really appreciate your insights and look forward to continuing these critical discussions in the months leading up to the Washington Summit.
Thank you.
So now I think it's time to transition to our next segment, and I'll turn the microphone to Philip Dickinson, who is leading our Transatlantic Security Initiative. Philip.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Minister Kasčiūnas, for sharing Lithuania's perspectives. Lithuania is a vital ally, and we really appreciate you sharing your thoughts and perspectives as we make the transition from Vilnius to Washington. As Dr. Koenig said, my name is Phil Dickinson. I am the acting director of the Transatlantic Security Initiative here in the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Continuing with our program, we will shift our focus to Brussels. We will just take a brief pause whilst we wait for the Ambassador, Honorable Julianne Smith, US Ambassador to NATO in Brussels, for a conversation moderated by Andrew Desiderio, Senior Congressional Reporter with Punchbowl News. So we will be back in just one moment. very much and welcome back, everybody. We're pleased to turn to the next session, which is a speaker spotlight discussion with the Honourable Julianne Smith, US Ambassador to NATO, moderated by Andrew Desiderio, Senior Congressional Reporter with Punchbowl News. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to all of you for joining us here in person, as well as on the live stream for today's event, a Back to Business Birthday, Priorities for the 2024 NATO Summit here in Washington. My name is Andrew Desiderio. I'm the Senior Congressional Reporter for Punchbowl News, where we cover the power, people, and politics that drive the decision-making in our nation's capital, specifically on Capitol Hill. I am delighted to be joined this morning, well, it's afternoon for her, by the Honorable Julianne Smith, the United States Permanent Representative to NATO, for a conversation here about U.S. priorities heading into the summit here in Washington. Ambassador, thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. We really appreciate it. I wanted to note at the outset, you were confirmed by the United States Senate in November of 2021 by a voice vote. I know you had to wait a little bit to get that final confirmation done, but I just wanted to emphasize the fact that the ambassador was confirmed by voice vote in the United States Senate. Obviously, we know that in today's Senate, voice votes for diplomatic nominees are very few and far between. So I wanted to mention that at the outset. Prior to her Senate confirmation, Ambassador Smith was a senior advisor to Secretary Blinken at the State Department. She was also Deputy National Security Advisor to then Vice President Joe Biden. With that, I want to dive right in. Ambassador, I don't think there's any doubt that NATO is stronger today than it's ever been. It's certainly bigger than it's ever been when we talk about the accession of two new member nations. And of course, the alliance celebrated the 75th anniversary this year. So celebrate we can, but of course there are some serious challenges as well that are top of mind for you and the work that you do there in Brussels. For one, Ukraine is at a pivotal point right now in its war with Russia. There's uncertainty about Ukraine's path to NATO membership, and of course geopolitical uncertainty with elections happening on both sides of the Atlantic this year that could have real impacts on the alliance as a whole. So with that backdrop, I'd like to get you to talk about how you define success at this year's NATO Summit, where there will presumably continue to be questions about the longevity, if you will, of the Western coalition supporting Ukraine.
Sure. Well, thanks for the invitation. It's great to join you this morning on the other side of the pond. Virtually, wish I could be there in person, but alas, this virtual connection will have to do. In terms of the upcoming summit in July, I think I would define success in kind of three main baskets. So first and foremost, as you said at the top, this is in essence a celebration at its very heart. We are marking 75 years of working together with our allies in the NATO alliance, over 7 decades of every U.S. president, irrespective of their political affiliation, supporting and leading this alliance, and we expect that to continue. So it will be a celebration, thinking about the alliance's agility, its adaptability, its resilience in the face of all sorts of new challenges. So that's success number one, making sure that we take a minute to mark the moment, mark 75 years of working closely with our allies and all that this alliance has been able to achieve over 7+ decades. Basket number two in terms of success is marking a moment in terms of burden sharing. 10 years ago, allies agreed to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. When we made that pledge, 3 allies were spending 2% of GDP on defense. Today, at last count, we are at least at 20. Maybe we'll get 1 or 2 more before the summit occurs. But we're going to be at the point where we can celebrate 2/3 of the allies meeting the 2% pledge. Now, the real celebration will come when we get to 32. And in the years ahead, we will be getting more and more allies. And we are marching towards that day when every member of the alliance will hit the 2%. But burden sharing will be a big part of what we talk about at the summit, and it'll be a key feature of the public engagement. And also when we talk about burden sharing, we just don't mean 2%. We are also talking about what we are all doing together to support our friends in Ukraine. And that brings me to the last category in terms of really marking success, having the opportunity to welcome President Zelensky to Washington to stand with 32 other leaders, to lock arms with him and make sure that Moscow understands a single message, and that is NATO allies aren't going anywhere. We are not distracted. We're not looking away. We're not growing impatient. We will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. And I think the message of solidarity, of resolve, of unity around what's happening in Ukraine will be a key feature of this summit. And of course, we are working right now on an actual deliverable for Ukraine, which we might want to get into here in our discussion. But broadly, I would say celebrating NATO's 75 years, ensuring that we help the world understand how important burden sharing is and how far we've come inside the alliance on that front, and making sure that Russia understands that we are all ready to continue supporting our friends in Ukraine so that they can prevail. All of that will be part of a successful summit.
You mentioned a deliverable for Ukraine. I'd like you to get into that if you can, to the extent that you can. And also note that Atlantic Council Senior Fellow Ian Brzezinski recently wrote that this year's summit should, quote, grant Ukraine a clear path to NATO membership. Do you agree with that? And if so, what needs to happen specifically at this year's summit in order to make that happen?
Well, first at the top, let me say NATO allies have been crystal clear. We've been clear since 2008 that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance. We reaffirmed that last year at the Vilnius summit when we said that Ukraine's future place is in NATO, but we were not prepared last summer to extend a proper invitation to Ukraine for full-fledged membership, and I am not expecting the alliance to do that this summer. What I am expecting allies to do is to construct a bridge to membership by offering Ukraine a deliverable that will enable them to become even closer to this alliance. Last summer, we created something called the NATO Ukraine Council, which just met a couple of weeks ago with President Zelensky, which enables Ukraine to come to the NATO table, sit at the table as an equal, and discuss whatever is on their mind. In this moment, we were able to talk to President Zelensky about his very real defense requirements, what they need right now in real time for success on the battlefield. But this NATO Ukraine Council is something that we already created last summer, and you're going to see more news on what the allies are prepared to unveil this summer at the summit. I can't go into a lot of detail because allies are in the process of debating that right now, but what I will say is we are looking at a way to institutionalize here at NATO some of the bilateral support that's been provided to Ukraine over the last 2 years.
As you know, Ambassador, last week, Congress finally sent a Ukraine aid package to President Biden's desk. It took several months. It took many iterations. It doesn't take a political scientist to conclude that support for Ukraine, at least in Congress, has gone down. Much of it, of course, is driven by the far right, as it is in other countries as well. You mentioned transatlantic unity and highlighting that at this year's summit. But what else can be done here in Washington in July to sort of counteract those forces?
Well, we're not waiting for July. I will say we collectively, the allies themselves and the United States, we are all working together to get a message out. We're getting a message out about the importance of this alliance, why it was important that we created it 75 years ago, but also to help Americans and publics on the other side of the Atlantic understand how NATO is a very different organization. NATO was created in a different era, and it was prepared for different threats. It was much smaller. There were only 12 founding members. We're almost at triple that now with 32 member states. And we don't just limit ourselves to our work here in terms of conventional military threats. This alliance, day in and day out, is looking at a variety of threats that cross a full definition of security challenges and threats. They represent our work on climate security, our work on cyber attacks, the emerging and disruptive technology, resilience, women, peace, and security. I could go on and on. We're working hard here on defense production. So what was once an alliance that focused primarily on conventional military threats now is an alliance that copes with and addresses the full spectrum of security challenges as defined by the 32 allies. So we have been working through public messaging campaigns to get the word out, to answer tough questions from students, from veterans groups, from the private sector, from small town mayors and governors. I've been out myself traveling across the United States, but so have many of our allies. They've made special trips to places like Iowa and Texas and Alabama and beyond. We have to broaden the conversation we're having in the United States about why we created NATO and why it's still important 75 years later. So this is an ongoing conversation that we're having with a variety of audiences, and I think you'll see that engagement carry through right up to the summit and, in fact, beyond.
As you know, Ambassador, the Senate NATO Observer Group is very active on all of the things you just mentioned. In a recent letter to President Biden, the co-chairs of that group, Senators Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire and Thom Tillis of North Carolina, wrote that this year's summit should feature, quote, a recognition of a stronger NATO partnership with allies in the Indo-Pacific. And one of the things that stood out to me, having attended the last two NATO summits in Madrid as well as in Vilnius last year, was the presence of these foreign leaders from Indo-Pacific nations. And you know, they are really engaged on the bigger picture security challenges, particularly Ukraine, even though China is the pacing threat in their own backyard. For example, the Japanese Prime Minister has said the best way to deter President Xi from launching an invasion of Taiwan is to defeat Putin in Ukraine. You hear, you know, a lot of people on Capitol Hill, including Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, say things like deterrence is not divisible. In other words, you can't allow Putin to just run roughshod over Ukraine, but also credibly say that you want to deter China from going into Taiwan. Can you talk a little bit about the involvement of Indo-Pacific nations in NATO as a whole, what you expect at the July summit in that respect, and can you talk about sort of why it's important to have them at the table?
Well, thanks for that. Absolutely. So NATO has 4 Indo-Pacific partners, and those countries are Japan, Republic of Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. These are 4 countries that have spent recent years moving closer to the NATO alliance, not because any of them are talking about a global alliance or joining it as a proper member, but because as partners, they value the opportunity to exchange best practices and insights on a variety of challenges that know no geographic limits. We are talking to our friends in the Indo-Pacific about things like maintaining our technological edge, about protecting ourselves and deterring cyber attacks. We're talking with them about disinformation campaigns stemming both from the PRC and from Russia and what those 2 countries are learning from one another. So those 4 Indo-Pacific partners find real value in exchanges with NATO allies, and similarly, I can assure you that the allies here find real value in exchanging ideas and best practices with those 4 countries. On top of it, though, most of our Indo-Pacific partners have provided valuable assistance to our friends in Ukraine, whether it's economic assistance, humanitarian assistance, or security assistance. And they're doing that because they understand that Ukrainians are not just fighting to preserve their own territorial integrity, but they are, in fact, protecting and trying to preserve the key tenets of the UN Charter. And that gets right back to the question of sovereignty. But I will also note that the alliance is increasingly talking about what the PRC is doing in and around the Euro-Atlantic area. This is increasingly a topic of conversation here inside the NATO alliance. We're doing a lot more work in this space. And as we look at that challenge, we can no doubt learn from our friends in the Indo-Pacific and figure out how they've coped with similar challenges in their own region. So if I had to guess, I would suspect that once again, we will see the 4 Indo-Pacific partners join us at the Washington Summit. Nothing's been finalized yet, but I think after having had them present, both at the Madrid Summit in 2022 and the Vilnius Summit in 2023, I think we would welcome the chance to have those 4 leaders join us again at the Washington Summit. So stay tuned on that front. But this is a set of relationships that I think all NATO allies, not just the United States, but all NATO allies find tremendous value in.
Something that's really important that you mentioned at the outset is this idea of burden sharing. As you know, the 2014 Wales Summit was a critical moment for the alliance because it effectively set that 2% benchmark in terms of defense spending as a percentage of GDP. We're now 10 years from that summit, but as you mentioned, much of the alliance is still lagging behind that benchmark. To what extent do you believe this year's summit should address that shortfall, or maybe double down on it and make sure that the number of nations that meet that benchmark is as high as possible?
Well, I would just note for your audience that when you use the word most allies now meet the 2%, and that includes countries like Germany, Norway. There's a lot of breaking news out there. So at least 20, if not more, are going to hit the 2% mark. So the majority of folks are there. Now, that leaves a handful of allies that are not yet there, but I will say those allies have plans in place to get to the 2% in 2-3 years. And we will push, and we have pushed in recent years, but we will push as hard as we can to ensure that all the allies get there. But I need to say something else, and that is last year, at the Vilnius Summit, we made clear that 2% is a floor, not a ceiling. And we said that because we also rolled out regional plans for the first time in decades. Now we have detailed military plans on what it takes to defend every inch of NATO territory. And in order to realize those plans, I think we are slowly reaching the conclusion that 2% will not be enough. And that is why some of the countries that are already in the 2% camp have moved on to 2.5 to 3%, and in the case of Poland, inching towards 4%. So allies are not waiting for everybody else to catch up. We have a number of allies, including some of our Nordic friends. We had the United Kingdom just make an announcement about their desire to get to 2.5%, Romania 2.5. So a number of allies are moving out on stretching beyond the 2% to ensure that we can replenish our stocks from the valuable assistance that we provided to Ukraine over the last 2 years, and keep giving Ukraine additional forms of security assistance. So this is generally a good news story. We will be sure to keep our foot on the gas here at NATO to ensure that every NATO member meets its commitment to get to 2%, but we are well on our way.
All right, and with that, we are out of time, unfortunately. But Ambassador Smith, thank you very much for joining us here today. And thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting us this morning. We look forward to seeing you here in Washington in July.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks to the Atlantic Council.
Thank you very much, Ambassador and Andrew, for that very insightful conversation. We're going to take a brief coffee break now for about 10 minutes, so come back at 10:45 when we will resume our programming with Atlantic Council President and CEO Fred Kemp, who will be moderating a discussion on the importance of supporting Ukraine ahead of the Washington Summit. Thank you very much, everybody, and we'll be back shortly.
Good morning to you all. Good afternoon in Europe, and hello to you wherever you're attending in the world. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and I'm pleased to serve as moderator for our fireside chat on the importance of supporting Ukraine ahead of the Washington Summit. Welcome back from your break here at our headquarters. And just so you know, that the Ukrainian ambassador can not only make policy suggestions, we've also made a very big policy change here at the Atlantic Council. She likes these cups. We are now going to offer all important people who are on our panels, and actually maybe even all people on our panels, a cup for the Atlantic Council. And so that's a great innovation, and thank you for that suggestion. And so the governments of Norway and Ukraine will not walk away from this session empty-handed. This year's curtain raiser event comes during a milestone year for the alliance as NATO celebrates 75 years of collective defense. Next week at the Atlantic Council, we'll have our Distinguished Leadership Awards. One of the awardees will be the Romanian president. One will be Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary, the famous actress, Michelle Yeoh from Everything Everywhere All at Once. And but in the question of the 75th anniversary of NATO, we're presenting our Distinguished Leadership Award, our Distinguished Military Leadership Award, to General Cavoli, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and we'll do a special salute that evening to NATO as well. And we'll be driving conversations about NATO this entire year, as the Atlantic Council always does with us, but a particular emphasis this year. We've seen clearly the bravery, the continued bravery of the Ukrainian people, even as Russia continues to leverage its war machine against Ukraine. Russia's war casts a dark shadow over the summit proceedings this July and mandates an allied response appropriately measured to this historic moment. I write an occasional column called Inflection Points. I wrote ahead of the congressional decision on the supplemental that it would have been geopolitical malpractice not to pass it. I'm really glad they did pass it. We're going to come to that in a second of what should come next. As heads of state and government convene in Washington, D.C. this summer, concrete steps need to be taken to give Ukraine the continued and enhanced support it needs from the whole alliance. We're all delighted to see the passage of critical U.S. support to Ukraine finally move forward last week, but we all know there's a lot more to be done. Before we go into this conversation, I'd like to briefly take a moment to introduce our guests on stage with me today. So first and foremost, I'd like to welcome Ambassador Oksana Markarova, Ambassador to Ukraine to the United States, who has been a partner of the Atlantic Council as we continue to work to support Ukraine. Ambassador, thank you so much for being here. Prior to taking on this role in 2021, the ambassador served in Ukraine's Ministry of Finance as First Deputy Minister and Government Minister on Investments, and then after 2018 as Minister of Finance. So we're honored to be joined by you today. Additionally, we are joined, and I'm just delighted, we just did a big gathering at your residence at the embassy, and we've been working together with you on for a long time on issues that you're one of the leading experts on, issues of Arctic, issues of security policy, law of the sea. So Anniken Krutnes is the Norwegian ambassador to the United States. She served with the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs since the beginning as a trainee in 1994, so you've been there for a while. In her previous position with the ministry, she served as Deputy Director General of the Department of Security Policy, and before that she was Norway's ambassador for Arctic and Antarctic affairs. This discussion is on the record. We're going to leave some time, as always, for questions from the audience. There's a microphone here where people can stand to deliver their questions. And if you're listening to us online, then please submit a question through askac.org, and they will show up on my screen here. Please identify yourself if you ask a question here or if you ask it online, as we like to give you credit for your questions. We also invite you to interact with us on X, formerly known as Twitter. by following @Atlantic Council and by using our hashtag Stronger with Allies. Let's start with how you see the situation following the passing of the supplemental and ahead of the Washington summit, and with the situation on the ground. In my own writing, ahead of the passing of the supplemental, I invoked Churchill, where he said that Americans would always do the right thing after exhausting all other alternatives. Churchill actually never said that, but it's a nice quote, and it's always, when you don't know who was the person who said something, it's always good to say Churchill said it. But the fact of the matter is, we took a long time to pass what should have been passed months ago. It didn't help on the ground, but we are where we are. Russia, there's great concern about a counteroffensive this summer from Russia that might be quite strong. And of course, we have a summit where people are going to be wondering what we're going to do regarding Ukraine, both over the short term, medium term, and long term. So let me start with you, Ambassador Makarova. If you can tell me, as you're looking at this, what are your highest priorities? What's your biggest hope in the months ahead, and maybe your biggest concern?
Thank you, Fred. Thank you so much for having us and for this very timely discussion, but also thank you for Atlantic Council for staying the course during this time, for all the publications and informing American public about what is important. Well, first of all, the priorities never changed since the day when Russia reinvaded us, and they frankly never changed since 2014 when Russia attacked us the first time. We need more weapons to Ukraine, more support to Ukraine, more sanctions and isolation to Russia. That has always been the priorities, and it's very important to keep a focus on it, because as long as the delay in Congress has been really difficult 6 months, and we are catching up now. But it's not just the decision. We shouldn't rest at the end of it saying, oh, great, the Congress adopted a supplemental, because it's the speed at which we will turn the supplemental authorizations into weapons or into support to Ukrainian budget or anything else, the information sharing, everything that was dependent on this very important support, plus with our European partners to work closer together on where we can be more complementary, because it's 796 days of war. There was no delays in Russian attacks. They have been attacking a very long front line. They have actually doubled down together with their North Korean friends and allies, together with Iran, on attacks on our energy infrastructure, civilian infrastructure. Every day they're destroying everything. So the biggest concern now, or the tasks, I would say, is more air defense to Ukraine as soon as possible, so we can protect. It's always cheaper to protect and deter than to fight later on or to reconstruct, as we know. But also all the weapons that we can get, the longer range, artillery, the sufficient quantities that we can actually be in a true active defense, which means we defend everything, but we also actively exploit where we could the openings and liberate. Because again, it's 796 days that Ukrainians are killed and tortured on the occupied territories. Just today, I don't know if you saw it, but there was a program on Ukrainian TV, 98-year-old Ukrainian woman who walked 10 kilometers from the occupied area to get to Ukraine-controlled area. And she said, I lived through the World War II. I'm living through this. I am not living under Russian occupation. And frankly, I remember the previous large war. It was not as brutal as this one. This is horrible, that Ukrainian 98-year-old women have to walk 10 kilometers to get away from Russians. So we all have to stay the course and double down now. That's what keeps us at night and days.
Yeah, well, I'll come back and follow up on that in a moment. Ambassador Kudnes, what's highest on your priority list?
Well, thank you. And first, also, thank you, Fred, for inviting us, and thank you for the cup. I have two. They provided me with water, but since I'm Norwegian, I also needed coffee. We're the second most coffee-drinking people in the world. The Finns are the first, and we're also among the happiest people, so there's probably a relation there between happiness and coffee. So I completely agree, of course, with Ambassador Markarova. This supplemental has to be turned into weapons aid as soon as possible. And I think it's very, very important that we don't relax and think, oh, the supplemental went through and no, things will be fine. Of course it will not. That supplemental is important, but it will not change the battlefield like that. You said it, you need the air defense to protect your cities, to protect your infrastructure, to protect your people. You need artillery, you need heavy tanks and all that. But I think we must continue thinking, what's next step? We cannot rest now and say, this went fine. And the combined packages from Europe and from the US together will gradually change the situation. But I think the most important thing now is that we don't stop and breathe because of the supplemental, but that we continuously continue our efforts, because we share the same goal. Russia cannot win this war, and you are fighting it for us. So that's the most important thing.
Let's take a look at that. There's a lot of conversation in Washington about Europe and Europe's support for this war that's not as well informed as it ought to be. How do you see, and I'll start again with you, Ambassador Markarova, how do you see the division of labor here? What most importantly are you getting from the U.S.? What most importantly are you getting from Europe? And how have you seen this evolve? As you know, there's some concern whether the American support will continue to come after what it took for this package to get through. And I just wonder if over time Europe would be able to step up. Obviously, you're forming your own capabilities, defense capabilities at the same time. So how are you looking at this is a gathering about NATO. How are you looking about how this transatlantic support is balanced between Europe and the United States, Canada for Ukraine?
Yeah. Thank you. Well, as we said at the beginning, it will take a village to win this war, because look at the map. You see Russia, you see us clearly, in order to win this war, in order to deter Russia from attacking not just Ukraine, but all of us, everyone have to participate. And I think at this point we can stop using, Europe has to step up, because Europe did step up a lot. So if we look at all the defense that we are getting, or other support that we are getting, first of all, if you look at the defense support, of course, U.S. is number one, and we're very grateful to our American friends, to everyone, from president to Congress to ordinary Americans who are actually supporting this. And there is no replacement for the U.S.'s role in defense support. But if you look at the budget support, which is equally important, because you cannot sustain the effort if you don't have money for police or for schools or for medical supplies or for anything else, because everything that Ukraine raises as revenues, we use for defense. Nobody is helping us to actually fund our armed forces. And frankly, we are spending more than 30% of our budget for defense of Ukrainian revenues. But in budget support, Europe is number one. Europe has not only approved this plan of 50 billion for the next 4 years, but also front-loaded it. When we were waiting for the support from the US, since last November, all the budget support that we had, and we do have gap on a monthly basis, a huge gap, was covered by Europe as a European Union, by individual countries, by Japan. Japan has front-loaded their very significant support during the first quarter of 2024. So actually, everyone is doing a piece. Now, if you look at by GDP contributions, then you suddenly will see that all the Baltic states, Nordic states, are among the leaders of providing the support to us. I mean, in some categories of defense articles, and I would not name them, but they have provided us 100% of what they had, because they understand how important to stop Russia while it's still in Ukraine. So I think it's, it's working together. It's stronger together notion, which actually will get us somewhere. It's not a competition. It's actually us joining forces and doing whatever it takes to win. And if the goal is to win, then all of us have to see what is it that we can do. And now in some areas like defense, Of course, we hope that U.S. will continue to lead, and Europe will continue to join, and we really hope that the longer-range artillery will not only come from the U.S., but also from other European countries, Germany namely, but also in the confiscation of Russian assets. U.S. and UK has been very clear on the readiness to confiscate. Some European countries are still reluctant and discussing and want to do only the profits. That's why we should not compete who's leading and who's not. We should sit down, discuss, and find a solution and move quickly together.
Are you getting what you want from Europe as opposed to the United States? What more would you like?
Well, the fast answer would be everything. I mean, we are fighting 800-mile active front line with Russians attacking us on a daily basis, with Russians now using these large bombs, which are turned avia bombs, which they turn into gliding bombs, and they are simply destroying residential areas, hospitals. Yesterday they attacked a mental facility. It's just, we need all the air defense, all the artillery, all the armored vehicles, everything. And none of us, friendly, peaceful countries, have enough in order to fight the war against a brutal enemy like Russia, especially given the fact that they don't have any red lines.
Yeah.
So we just have to come together and stop them. And we can, it's still a very winnable war. And we can see what we have seen in 2022 when we liberated 50% of our land territories that Russia occupied. We can continue repeating our success of 2023 in the Black Sea, when without having a big navy ourselves, with just our production of naval drones, we were able to liberate Black Sea and deter Russians from actually even going into some areas, and have the grain corridor, which we don't have to discuss with them even anymore. So we can do it in 2024, but because of all the delays, because Russians had time to dig in, because Russians had time to bring so much from North Korea, which is providing them with all these rockets, and producing together with Iran now. They're not only getting the drones from Iran, they're producing in Russia together with Iran. And they're actually improving all those capabilities. Now think about that it's not just a threat to Ukraine. They together improve what then we see flying into Israel, or God knows flying into where. So we just have to stop all of them together, this new axis of evil. And it takes, the right decision now would be for everyone to double down, provide us what you have, replace it later, but we have to stop this war.
I'm really glad you underscored that, because we're not seeing a stalemate situation in the war. What we're actually seeing is Russia's getting more support from North Korea, more support from Iran, and more support from China all at the same time. So I'm glad you. I'm glad you.
Because Fred, this is the decision.
Yep.
If they, with their GDPs so much smaller than ours altogether, if they can be so coordinated and organized, then the question we're answering: can democracies do the same? And it's not just a big statement, It's really, are we capable of defending ourselves and all democracies?
No, we have to be.
Yeah.
We have to be.
Yeah,
and I think you are completely right. If you look at the total allocated aid, Europe has contributed more than the US, but that's military, humanitarian, budget support altogether. Europe has actually stepped up. On the military side, if you look at what has been allocated, we're almost the same. 43 billion from US and 40 from Europe. That's before the supplemental. It's not yet there, the supplemental that was agreed. It's not yet allocated. So, and I think Europe maybe was a bit slow in the start. And if you look at those 40 billion allocated aid from European countries, 10 billion is from Germany and 10 billion is from the Nordic countries. So we really stepped up, and I think we will continue to have to. I mean, I think that's an understanding in Europe now that we actually have to understand there's a war going on our continent. We have to take responsibility for that. We cannot replace US military aid. And US is still the leader of the world, the most powerful military. We will need you. It comes responsibilities with being the leading nation of the world, but the US is stretched. There are other hotspots in the world, Middle East, Asia. So we have to actually take some responsibilities ourselves in Europe, and we are understanding that.
And from the standpoint of Norway, where do you see the priority of what you can do and what you are doing for Ukraine?
So we do budgetary aid, of course, but we also do a lot of military aid. NASAMS is produced by Kongsberg, a Norwegian company. They have just opened a new facility to really ramp up production. Government supports our industrial base. Nammo, who is one of the biggest producers of ammunition in Europe, is in Norway. The government bought a production line to be able to step up production of ammunition. So it's we donate F-16. That's for the long term, of course. We are together with UK leading the capability coalition for maritime. You mentioned the Black Sea. We're proud of what we're together doing in the Black Sea, deterring the Russians there. So we are doing what we can now, but we're also thinking long term. A year ago, we established something called the Nansen program, which had a 5-year timeline. We are now, of course, we have finished our negotiations of the MOU with Ukraine, which so many partner countries do. It will be signed by Prime Minister Sturla and President Zelensky soon. It has a 10-year horizon. So I think that is the important thing now, that so many countries, the 32 NATO countries, but also, I mean, the Ramstein Group has 54 countries aiding. And the combination of this immediate aid, what you can, but also the long-term perspective to deter Russia. And we have to deter Russia. And of course, the best thing to do to deter Russia is that they do not win this war. And then we also have to continue to deter them when this war is over. And that means building the strong force of Ukraine and of Europe. And we heard the Lithuanian defense minister talking about the east flank. Of course, we have to be able to deter Russia on the east flank.
Thank you for that. So let's fast forward to July, the NATO Summit. Ambassador Kudnes, Norway is a member of NATO. Ukraine is not. If you look at the Baltics, they haven't been threatened during this period of time. Poland hasn't been threatened during this period of time. Ergo, you would think that a NATO guarantee makes a country more secure, but there are other arguments that say that if you gave a NATO guarantee to Ukraine right now, it would make it less secure because Russia would test it. What's the, from your standpoint, what's the ideal outcome of the July summit? Also, keeping in mind that this became a little bit of a mess at the summit in Lithuania, where there were some disagreements. Was President Zelensky going to attend? Was he not going to attend? What was going to come out of it? What would be an ideal outcome this year?
Well, you heard the Honorable Julian Smith, the American NATO ambassador, saying that she didn't foresee an invitation to Ukraine coming this year. I think we have to build the bridge, as they say. We have to build the bridge to NATO membership for Ukraine. So Secretary General Stoltenberg has proposed that NATO gradually assume more responsibility for coordinating the military assistance to Ukraine. We have the NATO-Ukraine Council. And NATO has been working with Ukraine as a partner for many years, and it makes a lot of sense to use that framework for coordinating the military aid to Ukraine. And we also have all these, the memberships making bilateral commitments to Ukraine. And I think all these things together build that bridge to membership, as we say. And Assistant Secretary O'Brien said that bridge should be short, it should be broad, and it should be well lit. And I think that was very well said. So that's my hope for the summit, that Ukrainians can actually feel that they come a step closer with all these combined deliverables. And of course, a very, very clear signal to Russia that Ukraine is in DC and is a partner, and that we are in there for the long run. Russia cannot wait us out. There's no way.
Ambassador Markova, is that sufficient? Is a bridge to NATO membership sufficient? And what pillars and underpinnings should there be for that bridge, or should it be more than that?
I think it's important before we discuss any deliverables for any particular meetings, because there are many meetings. Today, Secretary General of NATO is in Ukraine, and he already met with President Zelensky. He's talking to Parliament. But I think we are focusing a bit too much on some specific meetings and not focusing enough on what the strategy is and what is the strategic objective that we have. And the strategic objective should be Ukraine must be a member of NATO, and Ukraine must be 33rd member of NATO. And for the past 16 years, since the Bucharest summit, we have been discussing, are we moving closer, not closer? We were finding different modalities. Is MAP required or MAP not required? But in 2008, we had a situation when Ukraine wanted to be a member of NATO and said that the leadership of Ukraine expressed this desire, and then the president of the US at that time was leading the effort and championing providing Ukraine with the membership action plan, and the leader of Germany at that time was leading the effort against it because it would provoke Russia, as we read in the article by advisor Hoyskin. Now, it's very important to say that these policies of buffer zones, gray zones, appeasing Russia by having Ukraine between NATO and Russia do not really work. It's actually quite opposite. NATO was never a threat to Russia. Russia was always a threat to all of us. Russia attacked Moldova in the beginning of the 90s, Georgia in 2008, Ukraine in 2014. During all these years, Ukraine and Georgia and other countries were neutral. That didn't stop Russia from attacking them. It's actually the other way around. If you are not a member of a civilized family of countries with the same values, that's when Russia thinks you are weak and they attack you. So I think we have to be very clear. Are we, after 16 years of discussions, on the same page or not with regard to the main thing? Should Ukraine be a member of NATO? And as the Ukrainian ambassador, of course, I would argue, but not only as Ukrainian ambassador, that Ukraine has a lot to add to NATO. With the most capable and battle-tested army, with the army that is not only using the NATO equipment, because we pretty much use now all the NATO-produced equipment, but understand together with the former Soviet and Russian equipment. And we have, even with the US, the Franken-Sem program, where we actually are using some of them together to the best of the use. And if you really want to deter aggressive Russia, which this is what it is, then you can only do it on the eastern flank. Now, which is the true eastern flank of NATO? This is the eastern flank of Ukraine. Because you cannot deter Russia from behind a very, very large territory unless, of course, you are prepared for Ukraine to lose this war, which we as Ukrainians are not prepared. It's an existential war for us. So we will fight until we win. And if we win together and Ukraine becomes member of NATO, that will make not only Ukraine, but NATO and all transatlantic family more secure. So this is, I think, what we have to discuss. And then if we are all on the same page on this, then how we get there, the very specific, concrete plan on how to be more prepared and ready for NATO, whether it's from interoperability perspective, which, by the way, we are doing through not only our EOP status, but our annual plans, which all of our annual plans with NATO Ukraine executed successfully, or through the NATO-Ukraine Council, which was created in Vilnius. I mean, there are venues to do that. Or if there are legal challenges to discuss, how do you progress while the country is in active war, then we should put together lawyers to discuss it. But that's all how, it's not what. Yeah. So I think we have to think, keep in mind and be, as ambassador to NATO, US ambassador to NATO said, to be crystal clear about that objective. And if that objective is shared by all, and if we don't have still, because it requires unanimous decision, right? So if all 32 agree on that, then there is no problem discussing how.
Yeah.
And then we should be able to come up for this or for the previous or for whatever venues with a very specific, commonly shared deliverables on how we are getting to that goal.
Ambassador, that's very clear. Ambassador Kunis, you've said Ukraine is fighting for us. You said that earlier in this conversation. To a certain degree, I agree with the Ukrainian ambassador that one shouldn't focus too much on a single meeting, and that it's more important the underlying direction. On the other hand, it is the 75th anniversary. It is a time of war in Ukraine, and I just wonder, from your perspective, short of NATO membership, what kind of security guarantees do you think the alliance ought to be giving to Ukraine from your standpoint? And then, Ambassador, to your point, from your perspective, which would actually move things forward to a sustainable post-war peace? Since membership is not going to be tomorrow, there's a path to membership, but one can make security guarantees along the way. And I can't help but point out the President Zelensky's comments after the defense of Israel from air attack from Iran. Israel is not a member of NATO. There were a number of countries that helped defend Israel at that time. Ambassador, he seemed to be pointing to why can't NATO do something of the same. So let me turn to you first, Ambassador Kunis, and then Ambassador Markova, of what are reasonable and possible security guarantees that one could move forward toward.
So I think the question of security guarantee.
Oh, and by the way, I will start taking questions, so if people want to go to the microphone, I'll turn to them. And we also have a couple of questions here in front of me on the screen as well.
So let me just first comment on my colleague's answer to the NATO membership. As Julian Smith also says, it's crystal clear. Ukraine should become a NATO member at some point, and hopefully sooner than later, of course. And there is a process, and there are different requirements and different milestones. And I think also these MOUs we are doing, part of them are also to help that process move forward quicker. And it is everything from the interoperability, as you said, as to helping rule of law, all the institutional reform and everything that I know you're working so hard on. The institutional reforms, the anti-corruption work, all that is on track. So we're looking forward to working with you on that. The security guarantees after war, that's a huge and complicated issue, and a lot of bright people, both in Europe and here, are thinking a lot of thoughts about that. And it has to deal with the bigger European security architecture. I don't think I should go too much into that because it is being discussed in so many places. But again, it deals with both deterrence. Of course, the deterrence of Russia is the most important thing. And we have to do that together. And the best deterrence is first to win this war and then to give Ukraine and also ourselves step up. Ambassador Smith mentioned that most countries now in NATO are on 2%. Norway is. Our government just made a defense pledge, which will take us to 3% during those years. That pledge is the long-term planning will take us to 3%. So that's also part of the security guarantee. It's the European security architecture where the European countries make sure they can have some credible deterrence towards Russia. So I'll leave it at that.
Please. Thank you.
When I was listening to the minister and ambassador, and we all always, as good constructive countries, focus on building bridges, but we also should focus on destroying bridges. So the best way to security, more security, is actually destroying those bridges, like illegal Crimean bridge and others, which Russia is building to sustain their attack on Ukraine. But again, what do we have to focus on now in order to get where we need to get? First of all, we have to focus on the battlefield. This is very important. And we have to do it now. And we have to provide or get everything or produce everything in order to win the war. Second, we have to focus on sanctions. Let's not forget sanctions, because this is a very important part of winning the war now, and also deterring Russia. And doubling down on them, finally sanctioning all Russian banks. I mean, we are talking about it for the past 2 years, and still there are only 55 Russian banks which are under full blocking sanctions out of, 326, I think now. We have to sanction all of them so that it's not convenient for other countries not only to buy something from Russia, but also to sell a lot of things to Russia and helping them to produce. Third, confiscating Russian assets. I mean, again, 2-year worth of discussions, lots of papers, including Atlantic Council. Thank you for taking an active part in that. We have to move forward and confiscate it and use those 300 billion to actually support the effort. Third, the security arrangements that we have with many countries now, we should have with more of the countries, so that we send a strong signal, planning signal, to Ukraine, but also to all of us together, how we're going to move forward. And that is also very important. So, I mean, there are so many things.
The information war.
Exactly. The disinformation and information. The Peace Formula Summit, which is also going to be this summer, which is very important because we need to we have already 83 countries and organizations that are participating in it, but it's a very important element together with weapons, sanctions, everything that we do together to get more countries to participate and push on Russia. For them to actually realize that it's not them against Ukraine. It's not even them against Europe. It's not even them against the West as they want to. It's them against everyone on the planet who believes in territorial integrity and sovereignty. And of course, NATO membership is such an important element of that. And of course, seeing what NATO is capable of. And showing it also in Ukraine, because there are so many NATO members that individually are helping us, and there is so much cooperation between us and NATO as institution already. That it's just natural that we have to move forward. And I just want to say something again, repeat what the minister said at the opening. Russia should have no veto power about this. And this is clearly what they are aiming to do. And they are scaring all of us and trying to bully all of us into not taking decisions, And sometimes,
but they're not very successful, and they have not achieved what they wanted. On the contrary, I mean, look at NATO, stronger than ever, and 2 more members. I don't think Russia is happy with having Sweden and Finland now as NATO members. So they are not scaring us. They're not. And I really appreciate the work you do here, Fred, because I think the transatlantic relationship, we cannot take it for granted. We have to work on it all the time, and you do a phenomenal job on that.
Thank you so much. So let me pick up a couple of questions. I'm looking to the microphone, and I think I'm asking Ian to go over there in a minute because I know he has a question, and I know he's just being polite. And maybe you could go behind Ian, and we'll do it that way. That's where we're going to do it. But let me ask a question from here. Neither one of you actually went to the question of what security guarantees NATO countries, either independently or otherwise, could give. One of the questions comes from Emily Dunn. Are security guarantees during an active conflict too little, too late? Does that not risk escalating or expanding the conflict with Russia? The debate I'm hearing in Washington is between those who believe that's right, that a security guarantee right now would expand the conflict, and those who believe just the opposite, that if a strong security guarantee were given to Ukraine, even if it weren't all of Ukrainian territory, but just the Ukrainian territory that is not in Russian hands, that it would actually increase the security of those areas. So why don't we take Emily Dunn's question first, and first, Ambassador Kutnis, for you about would a security guarantee during active conflict, either from a group of NATO countries or NATO itself actually expand the conflict or escalate the conflict?
Well, that's what the debate is about, and that's why I'm a bit reluctant to go into that debate, because there is so much. But you mentioned the possibility of just securing parts of Ukraine. I think that is that's a sensitive thing. I mean, the Ukrainians have to answer that, whether that is something they at all would be willing to. And these are very sensitive discussions, and I prefer actually not to be very clear on it.
No, and I respect that as well. One does have previous models. One has a South Korea model. One has a West Germany model. I know that at that point you didn't actually have missiles falling on West Germany, on South Korea from an adversary. That's a differentiation. But maybe you can tackle this, Ambassador. What would be a security guarantee that would not escalate things?
First of all, evaluating any models, we also have to evaluate the conditions that existed at that time. And I don't think any of them is truly applicable in this situation.
Yeah.
Second, we have to define what do we mean when we say guarantees. Because Ukraine saw it in 1994 when we gave up voluntarily our third largest nuclear arsenal. We thought we received security guarantees at that time. Well, we learned that there were assurances, and we learned that assurances are definitely not what guarantee is.
Yeah.
So I think we have to be clear that the only meaningful guarantee that could be there is a full membership in NATO. That's when we all protect each other with everything we have. That's a guarantee. Now, we're working on a lot of security agreements, how we will cooperate, what countries can provide to us. It's great that we have these agreements for 10 years or with longer period with some countries, because that provides us with the basis for the planning. But let's not get diverted from the discussion that the only security guarantee is when we together members of the same family of countries, and then we defend each other together. And frankly, again, I want to go back, and I'm sorry that I may be getting back to something that is not specific or concrete, but it's very important to point it. Russia violated not just Ukrainian border with this attack. They violated all rules and statutes of the UN, which we all believe and pledged is sacred. So anything short of full victory and Russians' withdrawal from Ukraine will not restore the international order which Russia violated.
Yep.
So when we are talking about security guarantees or anything else, we all talk about the situation, when Ukraine wins and Russia is defeated. Let's say it what it is. Because if that doesn't happen, then the whole international law is not restored at all. But if that happens, if we all work towards that, then I don't see why it will be a problem for Ukraine to be a full member of NATO at that time. So I think we are starting a bit of a discussion without putting all the variables on the table.
Thank you for that, and pointing to the larger stakes. Oh, now we have quite a lineup there, and I'll see how far we can get through it. And for the online audience here, please identify yourself.
Thank you, Fred. I'm Ian Brzezinski. I'm a senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council, one of Fred's volunteers. One of the criticisms of Western assistance, allied assistance to Ukraine, has been trickled out over the last 2 years. It's been always just enough to keep Ukraine alive, but not enough to be able to win. And the justification for that is the West, the alliance, didn't want to do too much to provoke Russia into escalating this conflict into the nuclear domain. That same issue permeates the issue of NATO membership for Ukraine. There are those who argue that you can't give Ukraine NATO membership today because it would provoke Russia into nuclear escalation. Do your governments agree with the alliance's estimation of that threat of escalation? Do you feel that the alliance and perhaps the Biden administration itself has been overly conservative, has exaggerated this risk of escalation, or do you share that perception of the risk of escalation?
And let's not forget let's use the word nuclear behind the risk escalation as well, because I think that's the biggest potential concern. Let me pick up 2 questions at a time and then come back to you, please.
Hi, Your Excellencies, Fred. Great seeing everybody. Vaga Maradian from the Defense and Aerospace Report. Disinformation has been mentioned by everybody on this panel, ultimately. It was only a few weeks ago that the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Mike Turner, made a case that American members of Congress were being Putin's useful idiots in this process. How do you get ahead of the information war when a large number of Americans actually depend on Telegram? They are, by their leaders, being bombarded by false messaging. And in the middle of this, we're having very intellectual conversations in places like this that are not penetrating this. We heard from Ambassador Smith how she's taken the argument for NATO to the American public. How do you fight this information war in a more nuanced fashion that is actually fact and sanity-based? That's just the tip of a larger iceberg, but want to see it insofar as how it affects Ukraine. Thank you very much.
So let's go to Ian's question first, which is the question of threat assessment, and also President Zelensky himself has warned us against self-deterrence. But take it in whatever order you like. Please. Yep.
I think the fear of escalation was bigger at the start of the war. I think there was more talk about the nuclear threat. I think we are past that. I think the reason you said aid has trickled down is there are other reasons. Well, here in the U.S., it was, of course, the lack of decisions by Congress. So I think actually what has happened was that in the beginning we were afraid of escalation. No, we just don't have the capabilities to give away. So that's my assessment. I don't think we are that afraid of escalation as we were in the beginning.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Let me add to that, because I think it's a very important question and very important consideration. We have been very clear, and of course I'm biased, I'm Ukrainian ambassador, and I represent my country and everyone who's fighting on the front line, but we have been very clear from the very beginning of this in 2014 and now. Russia always will talk about escalation because their goal is to deter other countries to help us in this fight. Their intent did not change. They want to destroy us, and they want to occupy all Ukraine and use that as the basis for their further escalatory advancements. So it's clear that they want to scare everyone into this, and they will raise their red lines or try to scare everyone, including with the nuclear threats. Mm-hmm. Every time they will see that you are moving closer to providing us some capability or to providing us more support or taking the decisions which are important and will reinforce Ukraine. But we also have to always remind people that during these 2 years, we have seen so many Russian red lines broken by Ukrainians, and nothing happened that is not happening even before that. So they said that, retaking Kiev Oblast would be a red line. We retook it, we liberated, nothing happened. They said that after the Shem referendums and including 4 of Ukrainian oblasts into Russian Federation, that would be a red line, and they will defend it with every capability they've got, and they hinted towards nuclear. As Putin was signing that, again, Shem exception, Ukraine already retook a couple of villages, which they said is now part of Russia. Nothing happened. Then they said Crimean Bridge is definitely, or Crimea is off limits. We conduct our operations there, and we will continue to do so. So we just have to understand everything they're doing to us, from tortures, rapes, killing civilians, all the war crimes, including those for which Putin is already indicted. There is a global arrest warrant for him as the war criminal for abduction of Ukrainian children. He's already doing that. He has been doing that during the past 10 years in Crimea and parts of Donetsk and Lugansk, and during 2 years, more than 2 years, everywhere in Ukraine. So actually, like with the typical bully, the right response is to act and not to get intimidated. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I go back, my father, who's no longer with us, but when I was a kid and I was asked him for some advice, he would always start by saying, think what you would do if you were not afraid. And I think it's a good advice now. Let's all think what we would do if we would not afraid. And of course, I'm not asking anyone to be reckless. Ukrainians are responsible people also. We understand all the threats. We have to discuss them, analyze them. But we also look through the Russian disinformation and propaganda and campaigns, which is very much related to the second question.
And we share a border with Russia. We've been neighbor to Russia forever, and the Soviet Union, of course, before that. We are not intimidated. We are firm, decisive, predictable, and that's the only language they understand. You have to be strong.
So I'm going to get to the disinformation question for you, Ambassador Kudnis, quickly. I want to get the last two questions before we close down. But let me ask you the question that the ambassador asked. Think what you would do if you were not afraid. Since you're not intimidated, not afraid, go to the NATO membership. Is it escalatory or is it de-escalatory? If we weren't afraid, would we do it?
Well, as long as there's a war going on, that kind of complicates the issue. I think Ambassador Markarova said it very clearly. We have to do things step by step here. And first, we have to win this war.
I got it. Disinformation.
I don't know how to fight disinformation in this country. May I say that? We have on our side to be very clear and to be fact-based. We have to make sure that our information is correct and that we can always stand the test of fact-checking so that nobody can say that we are doing disinformation. And then we just have to inform a lot. We have to be out there, and we have to prove it when we see disinformation. We have to be there and say, this is not correct, this is wrong. We just have to be there all the time. But it is extremely demanding in this information society.
Should I move on to the next question, or do you have a brief answer to this?
I'll try to be brief, but I think we have to do what we all have been doing times 100. When President Zelensky started talking to people directly, we all should do it. We should inform our citizens in all of our countries more. We should use all the social media and other venues in order to push the facts and all the information. We should differentiate between mass media and propaganda. And I think, the Russians are misusing the freedom of press in so many of our countries. And we should just stay the course, but it's very difficult. It's very difficult. And we see how Russians are evolving in their propaganda as well. So we have to be also more agile.
Absolutely. So, Trudy, great to see you here, and Dan, and please introduce yourself for the audience. And I'm watching organizers because I don't know when I run out of time, so if somebody could signal that to me, please.
Trudy Rubin from the Philadelphia Inquirer. I'd like to talk about what needs to be done between now and the NATO conference in order for Ukraine to survive. So first of all, air defenses. It seems that despite Europe's talking strongly, except for Germany, there's a real reluctance to put out. And as for the United States, we're exporting to Switzerland a system, but there's no sign yet that the US will provide. Can you survive without more Patriots? And just again on escalatory, de-escalatory, for the United States, it seems for the White House, taking Crimea or making it untenable was always a red line. Now the U.S. has sent long-range ATACMS. Do you feel now that there is no blockage on the United States side, no pushback from trying to make Crimea untenable, including blowing the Kerch Bridge? Thank you.
Dan.
Ambassador Makarova, I like your answer. I've heard you say this before. I like it even more now, that Ukraine should not worry about this or that meeting, but we should all focus on the end result we want, which is Ukraine in NATO. And then help win the war, all the problems get easier. So here's my question. We hear different things from the administration about military tactics. A month ago, I was in Kyiv when the word came out that the U.S. had asked Ukraine not to attack Russian oil refineries. That didn't go down well. Then we hear that the administration neither encourages nor enables attacks on Russian territory, implying they don't actually try to block them. Then Secretary of Defense Austin said pretty recently, well, he hopes Ukraine will use the ATACMS to good effect, and he didn't add the not in Russia. So what's your understanding of the American position? And if you choose not to answer, like, I get it, it's okay.
Well, thank you. And then thank you for your work. And I would encourage you to keep asking all of those questions. And of course, I cannot speak for the American administration except for to say how grateful we are for all the support. But let me be very clear from the Ukrainian perspective. We have to win this war. And we are defending ourselves in this war. And Article 52, if I'm not mistaken, of the UN Charter clearly allows us to defend ourselves by using all the means, including suppressing the threats coming from the country on the territory of the aggressor. So from the legal standpoint, we not only can do all the attacks and everything to liberate our country and defend ourselves, but we must do it if we are defending our country. Now, of course, we are dependent on all of our friends and allies on the capabilities. And right now, the more capabilities we get, the faster we can liberate everything. For us, there is no difference between Crimea or Donetsk Oblast or Lugansk Oblast or anything else. It's all Ukraine. And as actually the declaration of the US State Secretary from 2018, which was supported every year after that, it's also very clear. Crimea is Ukraine. There is no difference. So we have to liberate all Ukraine, including Crimea. And we have been always crystal clear with our partners and with our American friends with regard to that. Now, of course, there were always considerations. And as you know, some of the equipment is provided to us, which we can use. We cannot use it to hit targets in Russia. And we're not doing that. Again, Ukrainians are very responsible people. But, we have to win this war. And we have to do whatever is possible to win this war, of course, according to all the international rules. And again, we have to say that Ukraine is the one that is fighting on our own territory and still adhering to all the international rules, including how we treat the Russian prisoners of war. Unlike what they're doing, torturing our people, not just the prisoners, not our defenders, but the civilians. And
Trudy's question.
Yes, to Trudy's questions. And again, Trudy, thank you for all your work. And you were the first one to say who is Mr. Putin, if I remember, in 2000. And you knew that nothing good is going to be there. But no, we cannot survive without more air defenses. It's very clear on the front line how they're leveling out Kharkiv. They're pounding on Kharkiv on a daily basis. It's so close to the border that they can reach it not only with the ballistic or other missiles, but also with multi-rocket launch systems. What they're doing to Kherson, what they're doing to literally erasing. I mean, we all are talking about the towns of Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Mariinka, but let's say what it is. They did not retake those towns. They destroyed them. They just simply erased them from the ground. You can see it on the satellite images. So no, we urgently need the air defense. And when we say air defense, we mean the layered complex system. So it's not just the air defense, more air defense systems, but it's also interceptors, but it's also the F-16s, which will be, when they're there, a very important part of the air defense capability, and everything else. So, and it's really urgent. And because during the past 6 months when we were debating here in the United States, and again, grateful to Congress and Speaker for putting it on there, and everyone who fought for it so hard to be approved. But during the last 6 months, we didn't sign any new contracts. The US did not sign any new contracts, and we have to speed up everything now.
Thank you. Ambassador Kudnis, you have the final word.
Well, that's a big thing. But just to the air defense, you mentioned Germany. So the German initiative is something that more countries can join. If you cannot give an entire air defense system yourself, you can join forces, just as the Czech artillery initiative. And I think these new models of giving is a good one, is a creative one. So final word, we will win this war. We will win it. And that's a combination of giving everything you need right now and then also thinking long-term deterrence. We need to do both.
Thank you very much. So thanks for the audience, thanks for the online questions, and thanks to these two wonderful ambassadors and to your countries, and for the remarkable courage you're showing Ukraine and the remarkable alliance solidarity that we've shown thus far, which we have to show even more in the coming days and months. So a round of applause, and I'm going to pass. And I'm going to pass back to our silver-tongued moderator and MC, Philip Dickinson.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Ambassadors Krutnas and Markarova, for that excellent discussion. We will just take a couple of minutes break to rearrange the stage and I think maybe replenish our supply of cups before we get back for our final panel discussion, which will be moderated by Felicia Schwartz, U.S. Foreign Affairs and Defense Correspondent with the Financial Times, moderating a discussion on charting a path for the transatlantic community after Washington. So please stand by and we'll be back momentarily. Thank you.
Really talented people coming back in.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for sticking around for our final panel, Charting a Path for the Transatlantic Community After Washington. My name is Felicia Schwartz. I'm the FT's U.S. Foreign Affairs and Defense Correspondent. NATO's 75th anniversary was April 4th, 2024, and the world's largest military alliance has much to celebrate. This milestone marks 75 years of collective defense. And since 1949, NATO's 12 founders have turned into 32 member countries that together have deterred military threats and delivered relative peace and security. Now we are looking ahead to an important summit in Washington, and this milestone will form the backdrop of this summit. But while there's much to celebrate, there's also an intense threat environment that continues to present enormous challenges to transatlantic security and defense. I am here with an all-star panel today. I will start on the end. We have James Roscoe. He is the Deputy Head of Mission at the British Embassy, a job he's held since July 2022. Before that, he was the UK Ambassador to the UN General Assembly, and he's held a number of other senior positions in the British Foreign Service. Let's see. Next, we have Tom Wright. He's the Special Assistant to the President, Senior Director for Strategic Planning at the NSC. He was previously a Director and Senior Fellow at Brookings, and he's written several books, including Aftershocks, Pandemic Politics, and the End of the Old International Order. Next, we have Ambassador Yuri Kim. She's currently the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasian Affairs. She's a career diplomat who's worked on many key foreign policy and national security challenges, and was also the ambassador to the Republic of Albania from 2020 to 2023. I got to see recently how much of a celebrity she is there. And then last but certainly not least, we have Mr. Axel Dittmann. He is the Deputy Chief of Mission and Chargé d'Affaires at the German Embassy. And okay, let's get started. Just to kind of cue things up and looking back to 2023 in Vilnius and thinking about where we will go this summer, what is your assessment of how, and whoever wants to jump in first, go ahead. What's your assessment of how the implementation of NATO's plans from Vilnius are going, and where do you think things stand about 100 days out from the summit? Start with you at the end.
Sure. I mean, so I think let's remember, as you just said, that NATO has been around for 75 years now, and that's a significant milestone. We're talking about 1 billion people across the North Atlantic area who are secured by this incredible alliance that's really stood the test of time and emerged from the most extraordinary conflicts that Europe has ever seen. So fundamentally, I think NATO is in a good place. I think Vilnius certainly tested us, because Vilnius was fundamentally about Ukraine and the challenge that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has created for us as an alliance. But I think fundamentally, Ukraine has strengthened the alliance. I think Putin wanted less NATO, and he's got more NATO. He's got a rejuvenated NATO and 2 new members and a longer NATO border. So I think fundamentally, NATO is in a very good place, but we need to adapt and continue to think about how we face new threats and challenges. I think the Ukraine war has shown that the defense industrial complex is still critical, and we need to continue to invest in that. And the UK has just announced we're going to move towards 2.5% spend on our military defense budget by 2030. That is partly because we need to reinvest in our defense industrial complex. I think we've got to think about the future of conflict. You know, Ukraine and the Russians are constantly innovating on the front line. We need to learn from those lessons. We need to think about cyber. We need to think about how NATO comes together in the most capable tech countries. Think about our new going forward cyber policies and our cyber strategies and how we can contest in that space. And fundamentally, we just need to think about what conflict will look like in 10, 20 years' time. And I think as we think about the successes that we can celebrate in Washington, we also need to look to the future and what we need to be preparing for.
Tom, what do you think will feature at the top of the agenda for the summit, and especially, of course, for the U.S. and the president?
Yeah, I very much agree with James in that I think at this 70-year mark, I think there's a lot to celebrate, a lot to sort of take note of in terms of the critical role NATO has played in securing a free sort of Europe over many decades. And I think as we sort of look forward, and I know that's the topic of this panel as well, I think the summit will, Ukraine will be a key part of that, and finding that, unpacking what is that bridge to NATO and to membership for Ukraine. What does that mean? How can we help Ukraine strengthen its own defense and be able to deter sort of future attack? I think that's a key sort of element. But I very much agree with James too that there's a broader set of challenges there about the changing nature of conflict, about NATO's role in the world, about our sort of efforts to shape and reshape the international order so it aligns with our values and interests. And this summit sort of comes on the heels of what we've seen of authoritarian countries increasing their cooperation with each other in a range of different areas. I think what we're seeing with NATO, but also with our alliances and partnerships more generally, is that our allies and partners are deepening cooperation with us in very significant ways, both to address immediate challenges, but also to build that capacity sort of for the future.
And Ambassador Kim, just to turn to you, in terms of how the priorities will stack up, what areas of divergence do you anticipate, and what areas do you think will be easier to solve?
It's a terrible question. Look, the fact of the matter is that NATO is bigger, it's stronger, it's more united than at any time in its history since the end of, certainly since the end of the Cold War. And so as we head towards the summit in Washington this summer, we're looking at celebrating how far we've come and what we've accomplished together. We are looking carefully at the threats that we face now, and then we are projecting ahead, and that's really the key part of all of this. It's celebrating 75, but we're also positioning ourselves to make sure that we are ready for the next 75. That means that we're going to have to do things like, as James has mentioned, we're going to have to look at future threats. There are already emerging threats, but we want to be sure that we can handle things like hybrid, cyber, all of those other threats that are on the precipice coming towards us. We want to make sure that we are preparing Ukraine for membership when that moment comes, which we hope will be soon. The president's been very clear. Ukraine's future is in NATO, so they will be part of our alliance. And then the third part is making sure that all of our allies are able to fulfill the commitment that we have made to each other. And that includes burden sharing. So 10 years ago when we made that commitment to each other on 2%, we were at a point where only 3 of the allies were meeting that mark. 10 years on, 20 of our allies are meeting that mark. So 2/3 meet that. And we've all agreed that 2% is the floor and not the ceiling. So we're looking at a very robust increase and modernization of our capabilities. And we're looking at an alliance that really is increasingly at the core of global security.
And DCM Dittman, what do you see as Germany's priorities heading into the summit?
Well, thanks very much, and I can really support everything that has been said. Very important.
No disagreement.
Very important and important summit, 75 years. The alliance, Transatlantic alliance, very, very strong. Exemplified by the accession now of 2 new members, Finland and Sweden. And so we have to focus on new threats, cyber, other threats, that will be one. And of course, Ukraine will be very important also on the agenda. And Vilnius last year also reaffirmed the long-term goal of NATO membership. That is clear. We have to help now Ukraine also right now. We see a stronger role for NATO also in coordination of military systems. It's something we are working on. And I think there's a number of other things also in looking at the capability really of NATO to react in this current security environment, to really increase deterrence, to increase the capability to defend itself. And we're looking at the implementation of things that were discussed last year. And there's a number of very concrete things that we are all already doing. One thing that I would like to mention as an example is also shoring up the eastern flank of NATO. I think that's a very important thing. It's something where we are trying to also contribute very concretely. We will station a permanent brigade in Lithuania. It has been signed. Work is starting on that right now. So I think lots of things we'll have on the agenda for a very successful NATO summit.
I don't know how many of you watching or in the room were at the Vilnius Summit last year, but the Ukraine deliverable definitely proved to be a bit contentious and dramatic at the end, which I think is sometimes rare for NATO summits. So with that in mind, do you anticipate any drama on the Ukraine deliverable, or what do you see as a realistic deliverable, and how can you get there? I'm sure all of you are lining up to answer this question, but maybe we'll start with either Ambassador Kim or Tom.
I'm happy to jump in. I mean, I think if you look at what happened last year, I think it came out in a pretty constructive place. But if you look at the disagreement that was there, I think part of it was on, the type of words that sort of signify, commitment. And I think on the one hand, you had people who said, that we have signified commitment to Ukraine joining NATO, that's been very clear, and then others that wanted slightly different formulation of words to illustrate that. And so it was a bit of more of a rhetorical difference than a substantive difference. I think what we're focused on sort of this year is very much like what concretely can we do to strengthen Ukraine's, capacity in defense, and also to build out that bridge to NATO, and that has sort of several components, to it. One element is sort of NATO's role in working with Ukraine, and we're working on that with the allies and with Ukraine sort of at the moment to build that out. That will be one piece. I think a second piece is the bilateral, security agreement that we're working on, with them now, which started actually in Vilnius with the joint, declaration, but that is about making sure that we're trying to build their capacity to defend themselves and to deter a future attack, to build that force of the future in Ukraine. That is not, and I think there was some confusion on this last year in the general debate, that is not incompatible with NATO membership in Article 5. It actually, strengthens it, because when Ukraine joins NATO in the future, if it has a very strong military that's capable, of deterring a Russian attack, on its own merits, that will, but as a standalone sort of force, that will be strengthened and enhanced by sort of the Allied commitment as well. So we see these things really as going together. And then the final piece, I think, is the, support for Ukraine's defense industrial base, helping them to do the type of things they need to do, as you, I think, mentioned earlier, to be making those innovations, on the battlefield, to help them, defeat Russian forces in Ukraine in real time. So, but Yuri may have additional things to add, but I think that's how we, sort of see the that sort of deliverable part.
I take a little bit of issue with your use of the term drama.
That's fair.
For this. It's actually, to me, it's not drama. It's actually the importance of the moment. And I think allies and much of the rest of the world are very alive and alert to the threat that Russia is posing. We have one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council having invaded a neighbor, and is flouting the most basic rules that have governed international relations and that have undergirded peace and security for much of the world for the last 80 years since the end of World War II. This is a big deal. And if we were having boring talking points read out to each other at a summit or even in a forum like this, that would be cause for worry. So the passion and the commitment with which people are staking out positions as we head towards Washington, I don't think that's an issue at all. I think that's a healthy, important, and good thing. But as I said, what's very clear to me as I work these issues is that we are bigger, we're stronger, and we are more united than ever before.
For either of our DCMs on stage, what language do you think is on Ukraine is realistic at this point? I don't know who wants to jump in first.
Well, I think Tom captured the spirit of the intent with this concept of the bridge into NATO for Ukraine. So the UK is absolutely convinced that Ukraine's place is in NATO, and we want to see, accelerating trajectory on that. But I think Yuri is also absolutely right that fundamentally we need to help Ukraine fight this war right now, and that absolutely has to be the focus. We need NATO to get behind Ukraine and help them start pushing that line east. So that needs to be the focus. And if there's and I agree, there has to be passion in this debate, because what we want is people coming with ideas and coming with challenge and actually testing the proposition so that we get this right. We've got to get it right. And so in some ways, drama's not a bad thing. I'm not sure it was as dramatic, maybe, as the FT may have written it up. But the key thing is that we're having a conversation, and that conversation is lively and helps us arrive at the right point. One thing I will say is, this is an important landmark summit. It's happening in Washington, and I think the incredible focus the United States is bringing as host and the partners are bringing to the discussion in preparation gives me confidence we'll get to the right place.
And what do you think is realistic, or what does Germany want to see on Ukraine?
To pick up on a few of the points made, we have as I said before, in Vilnius, we reaffirmed the long-term goal of NATO membership, and I think we are now working really on implementing commitments that were made there. Meetings of the NATO-Ukraine Council is an important one. We are working through the bilateral security arrangement. We are working on interoperability. So I think these are important issues and we will be working on a stronger role for NATO in coordinating a part of the military assistance. And at the same time, it is so important that we really work on the very practical things to help Ukraine to make sure that Russia loses. And there's a number of things which are happening, short-term things like, for example, air defense. We have just stationed a third Patriot system in Ukraine. Other things, the production and delivery of ammunition. And I think we have taken some very concrete steps here, also in building new factories, doing that. But of course, it is so important also this decision here taken last week for the supplemental to fill in the gaps and to deliver this, what is so urgently needed.
Ambassador Kim, just to follow up on a thread from DCM Dittman here. I know at the most recent NATO foreign ministers meeting, this proposal you just mentioned about NATO taking a greater role in coordinating assistance came up. My reporting in the FT suggested that maybe Stoltenberg is a little more enthusiastic about it than the US might be. I wonder where things stand on this idea, what you all at the State Department think about the notion of NATO playing a more organizing role, and especially because now the US has been able to pass this supplemental, which was, I think, in doubt when it was first brought up.
So a couple of things. In our 2022 strategic concept coming out of NATO, we identified Russia as the biggest threat against Euro-Atlantic peace and security. So that's number one. Number two, the reality is that almost every NATO ally is providing significant support to Ukraine. We want to make sure that as we contend with the threat posed by Russia, And as we support Ukraine's effort to win the war that was imposed on them, that we do so in an organized and coordinated fashion so that we're frankly making the best use of taxpayer dollars for each country. And we are providing Ukraine with the support that it needs on a timeline and in a fashion that makes the most sense on the battlefield.
And Tom, just to follow up on something, you mentioned the bilateral agreements that were announced last year. I think the UK has completed yours. Yeah. You were the first ones, I believe. How would you grade the process of getting those agreements up and running, and where would you like it to be in 100 days' time?
Yeah, I think it's gone very well. You know, I don't know what, you know, obviously biased in terms of the grades, but I think the process has gone well. I think if you look back to where this started, you know, I think prior to Vilnius, there was maybe a bit of a sense that the question with Ukraine's role in NATO is sort of binary. You know, they're either a member or sort of not a member. And I think, you know, what we were trying to do was to think about ways in which we could unpack that a little bit and make sure that as Ukraine progressed to being a member, which is, you know, complicated obviously because they're in the midst of a major, you know, war right now, that we could take steps, you know, that would sort of enhance their, you know, defense and security in the here and now and in the next few years. And so whenever that moment arose, when they did join, that they would be in a stronger position. I don't think that that was, you know, necessarily sort of obvious to everyone, including to them or to ourselves, you know, at the time. I think there was a sense that maybe, you know, does that take away from NATO? Is that something different? And I think in the run-up to Vilnius, it was sort of agreed that this is sort of an important part. And then those negotiations, I think, as the UK sort of demonstrates, have gone well, and other countries well and quickly. We are sort of well on the way, you know, on ours. And so I think that will, you know, unfold between now and, you know, over the next 2 months.
Announce it at NATO?
I think we're still working on like exactly when and how to finalize and to, you know, to announce it. But I think they are increasingly seen as sort of an important and key component, you know, of Ukraine's security, but also, you know, of its membership in NATO.
And okay, now this is one for our British and German friends on the panel. DCM, we will start with you. Shortly, I think right after the NATO summit, there will be the Republican convention. Trump, the Republican candidate, has pretty consistently suggested he could, you know, drag America away from NATO and wants to see Europe, of course, do more regardless in the alliance. What message do you think, or would you like to have Trump, and not just Trump, but members of his party who are skeptical about U.S. presence in NATO, what do you hope will be on display at this summit as that sentiment is growing in the U.S.? You're next, so.
I think an important signal to come out, but I would say that regardless of elections coming up, is the strength of the alliance, the strength of the Transatlantic alliance, completely crucial for the security in Europe. Something which really is also crucial for the interests of the United States. And practically, I hope and I believe that what will come out of the summit is not only the very clear support, practical support, strategic support to Ukraine, but it's also the question of Europe stepping up to its commitment here, that the burden sharing is not just a slogan, a word, where Europe is not delivering, but that Europe really is taking this responsibility serious and is doing this with very concrete money and measures. And you, I think, Kim, mentioned 20 members now of NATO who have are fulfilling the 2% goal. In Germany, it's now 2.1%. And the clear commitment also by political leadership that this will be done in a sustainable manner. And then I think the other thing which should come out, and I guess will come out, is that this is not just also about money, but about very concrete projects which are going on. We are shoring, as I said before, shoring up the eastern flank by stationing a permanent brigade. Together, we are looking at very concrete armaments production to really have the deterrence and the defense capability. So I think out of the summit will come signals about the necessity of the alliance and also about very concrete contributions, in particular also by Europe.
Anything to add?
I would just say that, from a UK perspective, the United States has led NATO throughout its time and has provided leadership throughout its time. And President Trump has already been the president of the United States, and the United States remained committed to NATO right through that period, and again provided leadership right through that period. I think he rightly drove NATO to do more on spending, and Ambassador Kim talked about the fact that we've moved from 2014 with 3% of members spending 2% up to nearly 2/3 of members now. I think continuing to push that and making sure that 2% is the floor. As I said, the UK is now committed to 2.5 by 2030. I think that is important. I also noticed that just before the supplemental passed last week, President Trump asked for Europe to do more in Ukraine. Well, we are doing more in Ukraine, and we will continue to do more in Ukraine. But he also said that we need a secure and strong Ukraine, and I think we can also agree with that as well. So I think we know the United States will continue to be the essential partner for Europe, whatever happens.
And then before we move on to dig a bit deeper into burden sharing for either Tom or Ambassador Kim, I wonder how, the supplemental, of course, has loomed very large over all of these conversations, I'm sure. I wonder what you're hearing from the other members of NATO about this sentiment as you are in the run-up to the summit.
Yeah, I can start out. I mean, I think the first point, just to reinforce something Ambassador Kim said earlier on the amount of burden sharing that we're seeing. A lot of it is often focused on the 2% number because of the historical sort of importance of that from the Wales Summit, and I think that's, critically important. But I think you can also look at it in dollar numbers too, right? And if you look at the 3 years of this administration, our sort of allies and partners in NATO have increased their annual spending in defense over that period of time by about $78 billion a year. If you look at the 4 years previous to that, the increase between the start of the administration and end of the administration was approximately $70 billion, right? So, and previous to that, in the Obama administration and prior, we were sort of in a period of more cuts generally up until 2014 when it started to increase again. So I think you can make a strong case that what we've seen over the last 3 years is actually a historic sort of increase in allied activity on their sort of defense and security, particularly in Europe, but also more generally. And we've seen European allies become quite interested in what's happening in the Indo-Pacific, and the Indo-Pacific becoming quite interested in what's happening in Ukraine and in Europe, because they see sort of our security as interdependent, and linked. So I think there is we've seen real historic sort of achievements, I think, on the burden sharing side. The other point I would just make in answer to your question about, are people nervous or what do they think about happening? I'm not going to get in, obviously, to the election piece of this, but I would say I've seen, reports that say, we're trying to Trump-proof this or do things like that. That is not, I think, what we are doing at all. Like, we are trying to take steps at NATO and in the relationship with Ukraine that make sense regardless of who is president, right? They are things that we think are sensible and right, for U.S. interests, regardless of who is sort of in the office, which is what I think, we should be doing. It's not about trying to, think through different, scenarios and how to box people in. There's still lots of optionality, there sort of going forward. But these are steps, I think, that make, that enhance U.S. interests, make transatlantic security stronger and make Ukraine stronger as it fights for, its existence and for its sovereignty.
I will ask you a different question, Ambassador Kim, which is we've all, or you have all spoken a lot about 2% as a floor, not a ceiling. I wonder from a U.S. perspective, beyond spending more money on defense, what type of planning capacities or capability investments do you think, or does the U.S. think that European allies need to kick up to try to increase and more equally distribute burden sharing in the alliance?
So I want to underscore again that allies together are doing much more than we've ever done in quite some time. And what Putin has succeeded phenomenally in doing is in concentrating the mind and in reinvigorating the reason why NATO exists in the first place. As we look to the future, the next 75 years, we're going to need to look very carefully at the capabilities that we need, and allies are very closely engaged in that discussion. You'll see that reflected in some of the documents that come out during the summit in Washington. But beyond that, we all have a recognition that we also need to reinvigorate our defense industrial base. What we're seeing now is Russia, with the assistance of Chinese companies, is reinvigorating at a pace and scale that we haven't seen since the collapse of the Soviet Union. We have to at least keep pace with that, at least. And I think most of us agree that we have to beat that. So whether it's looking at what we need to do in the United States to increase the pace with which we produce air defense, for example, or we look at the production of F-35s or F-16s, every country is going to need to look at that, and we as allies are going to have to come together on an agreed plan for who does what.
If I can turn to you, I think you mentioned Germany's commitment to defense spending earlier this year. Tell us a bit more about, what this means for the alliance going forward and what you hope to see from other countries as they're making commitments in the summer. I just mean, what signal do you hope that Germany's pledge to spend more sends?
So I think for us, it's the well-known concept of the Zeitenwende speech 4 days after this renewed Russian invasion of Ukraine, and I think this was really a strategic shift for us, and committed 100 billion euro for defense. And I think we are putting that absolutely to use. There's a lot of procurement decisions which are already being implemented. A lot of them also in close cooperation and benefiting US producers. The F-35s, the Chinooks, P-8 aircraft. So these are very substantial things. But I would like to this, of course, not like this the one-time thing. It, as I said before, will be a sustainable thing. And I'd like to pick up one thing which Yuri just mentioned here. That is the defense industrial base. To really also to produce equipment, to produce ammunition that we need. There's also a proposal now within the European Union. The Commission made its proposal to really ramp up the production. This is something we're looking at. So this is something where we, and there's lots to do still within the EU. We are aware of it to really speaking about joint procurement, interoperability, joint research and development, joint production, you name it. And I think there's really a lot of things. I mean, we have this important blueprint on the table, and there's also, I think, some important steps going on. So this is not a theoretical discussion. I can say for us in Germany, this production facility for 155 millimeters, which was just started construction, but also air defense. We will build a factory in Bavaria to produce Patriot systems. Yeah, so this is really, I think, things which are going on in full complementarity and interoperability with NATO, of course, because NATO remains the bedrock for our security. And if I may say, even if the I spoke now about the European Union. Of course, very close cooperation with the UK, as was made clear, and we could see when the British Prime Minister was in Berlin last week, and they also announced joint production of, I think, an artillery system. So I think this is really shows that it's not as was said here, is not just a number and figures, it's really also about very concrete capabilities, and coordinated joint approach shows the strength of NATO.
Just digging into some of the commitments on the defense industrial base that were made at Vilnius last year, NATO leaders agreed on the Defense Production Action Plan, aiming to create a sustainable defense industry, as all of you have discussed. What do you think is required for the implementation of this plan to be successful? And how can allies and particularly industry partners step up to make this a reality?
So I think one of the things we need to do is show long-term spending commitment, so that the private sector, so industry, can with confidence make the investments they need to be able to deliver what we need. And Axel's just referred to some of the steps that the UK and the German partners have taken to show that commitment, to signal that long-term spending will be there for that. And I think that needs to happen in the artillery space, in the air defense space, but we've also got to focus on the cyberspace as well. And I think Ukraine has really shown that you need real rigorous cooperation with the private sector to think about your cyber vulnerabilities and how you defend against attack, and where you need to, how you have the capability to inflict damage if you're attacked in turn. So I think, working with the private sector, with the big tech capable countries across NATO, to work out how we make those partnerships work. And then finally, learning from Ukraine. Both sides are innovating in extraordinary ways on the front line at the moment, particularly in terms of drone warfare, the use of AI in terms of targeting acquisition. So making sure we stay on the cutting edge of that and make sure our technology is future-proofed and ready for future conflicts.
And Tom or Yuri, I wonder if you have any thoughts about what deliverables on the industrial base we might expect to see, or what you're working towards.
We're still working out the package for Washington, but I can tell you that the defense industrial base will be a significant part of it.
And no more details for the rest of it. We'll have to wait and see. Anyone else wants to add on the industrial base, or?
Can I just say one thing? I mean,
Yeah.
I think what we're seeing in Ukraine is sort of quite interesting, because we have sort of two buckets of things we need to do on the defense industrial base. One is existing companies and the production system, and how to crank out more sort of 155 or other things that they need. And I think that's happening. It's incremental, painfully incremental, because it's not a money issue. It's, it's all sorts of things that go into that, including on supply chains and other things. There's been an enormous amount of work on. So I think that's one side of it, and that's for us, for the United States, for our allies and partners, but also for Ukraine. The other part, which I think they've been quite sort of adept at, is actually very entrepreneurially, close to the battlefront, and designing sort of specific responses to particular problems that they encounter sort of in real time. Sort of, I don't know if it's quite a bottom-up approach, but it is more sort of bottom-up than our existing systems. And that, as I think James is saying, like, we can learn from that. I think that's something we can help sort of facilitate. But I think you're seeing those two different sort of vectors, of change, like come together, and we're, we need to sort of recognize that and build on it, and obviously with the view to helping them.
And then obviously Ukraine has a lot of very immediate needs, as we've seen with the supplemental and the announcements that the UK has made and others and so on. How can the alliance balance this critical moment for Ukraine with planning for its longer term future?
So what I would say to that is, Russia have very clearly signaled they remain the greatest threat, immediate threat to NATO. And in many ways, Russia have shown their hand in terms of the threat that they pose. So I think in the immediate term, making sure that we have the capability to deter Putin further and to give Ukraine what it needs to succeed and make sure that Putin fails in Ukraine, those are the two immediate issues. Tom touched on the fact that we also need to talk to our Indo-Pacific partners, and we'll do that again in Washington. I think, as we've seen, Ambassador Kim talked about Chinese help to Russia in terms of their own rearmament process. I think it's very disappointing to see that from some Chinese companies, and I hope the Chinese government will look very carefully at this and do what they can to curb that activity and stop that activity. But I think we need to see the continuum of threat globally and work with our partners across the world to make sure that we secure our future.
I think just one more question for all of you before we turn to the audience and our viewers at home. So think of your questions now. Just picking up on this thread about China and the Indo-Pacific. I wonder if each of you could weigh in on how you think China, whether it's its role helping Russia in the conflict in Ukraine, or how NATO is thinking about China, how China will figure in this historic summit. Maybe Ambassador Kim, start with you.
Yeah, there's an increasing connection that's becoming obvious to everybody that what happens in the Indo-Pacific has a direct bearing on security in the Euro-Atlantic. So you're going to see more and more of that discussion and that strategizing as we go forward. One of the ways in which we talked to the Chinese about this issue, and Secretary Blinken, I'm sure, discussed it with Wang Yi and everybody else that he saw in Beijing when he was there a few days ago, is that you can't, on the one hand, say that you want a stable, peaceful, productive relationship with the United States and with Europe, on the one hand, and then on the other, enable what we have clearly and very publicly identified as the greatest threat to our security. So you can't have both of these happening at the same time. So China's got to make some tough decisions as well. And if their past decision-making is anything to judge by, we think overall, they'll decide to invest in the future, which is they need the European market. They need cooperation with the United States. And we'd like the same. We don't have any interest in having a contentious relationship with China. We want to compete, but we don't want a conflict.
China will figure. Chancellor Scholz was recently in China.
I can really subscribe to what Yuri Kim just said. What happens in the, and James, it happens in the Pacific has also an impact on our security in Europe. It's important to have a strategic discussions with Asia-Pacific partners, which is going to happen, together with a discussion also with the EU, very important. And I agree that it is, you cannot have like you cannot separate trade and security, treat it as like completely unrelated, and Chinese support for the Russian war effort with the dual use is very critical for and problematic for European security, and it was raised by the Chancellor also in his discussions when he was in Beijing. So it's an important issue.
Okay, I think we will open up for questions. I have some on the iPad here, but if there's anyone in the room that wants to ask one, I think there's supposed to be a microphone. And please introduce yourself.
My name is Katerina Shankaruk. I am affiliated with the Bush School of Government and Public Service, and I have a question to all panelists. So we know that Putin believes time is on his side, and that he basically counts very much on the political landscape changing in 2025 to his advantage, and not only political, but the military consequentially. So my question to all of you, what conclusions would you like him to draw out of the Washington summit? Thank you.
I'll just keep it very simple. NATO is bigger, stronger, more united than ever before. Mr. Putin has been wrong from the start. Many of us, in fact, have been wrong. When he went in with his full-scale invasion, which, by the way, we warned about publicly, and he lied and said he had no intention of doing that. He went in on February 24th, 2022, with the expectation that Kyiv would fall within days. Didn't happen. What the Ukrainians have been able to achieve over the last 2 years, beyond the simple act of endurance, is to push back the Black Sea Fleet, which I bet you none of us would ever have predicted. They've kept Odessa open, they've kept business going, and they have damaged the Russian army in ways that we couldn't have imagined. So I would say that Mr. Putin might want to be a little bit more modest in his predictions about what could happen, and I think we also should take some lessons from what we've witnessed over the last 2 years.
Yeah, I think the message will be that Putin will fail, that NATO is resolute and united in its support of Ukraine and will stand with Ukraine until Putin is defeated, and that he needs to start thinking about a plan B.
Hi, Trudy Rubin from the Philadelphia Inquirer. There are several weeks before the NATO conference, and what happens on the ground in Ukraine between now and then will be critical. So I'm wondering, given the domestic concerns both in the United States and in Europe about air defenses, I want to ask everyone, do you think that the 7 additional systems that the Ukrainians say they need desperately to defend their cities will be found between the EU and the United States? Germany has led the way with a new one in addition to what they've already sent. But everyone else seems to be having a lot of trouble in figuring out how they can give more. And on the German side, you've been in the forefront with your new system of Patriot system on offer. But is there a chance that Taurus will follow ATACMS?
On the last question, I cannot really say anything beyond that. There's my highest political authorities made a statement on that on the record. So I have nothing to add on this one. But I can say that we are the second largest military contributor to Ukraine, largest in Europe. We are absolutely determined to continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. The goal of defeating so that Putin does not win, but is defeated. And I can say that we're also trying to look at the, as you pointed out, as a very immediate needs for Ukraine. Air defense is one. Delivered a system and are working together with partner to try to get more to Ukraine.
I don't know, Ambassador Kim, Tom, the U.S. is coordinating all of this.
Yeah, I can start out. And Trudy, good to see you. I think it's a great question. So I think I would, before I get to the air defense piece, I would just say, you know, what we've been saying publicly over the last few weeks, which is we are worried about Ukraine's situation. You know, the fact that the supplemental took so long, you know, thankfully it came through, and that's a you know, great sort of achievement for everyone, and I think it's absolutely critical to Ukraine's success. But the problems that existed a few weeks ago won't be solved overnight. I mean, it takes, as fast as we rush this stuff to Ukraine, it will take time, you know, for it to be absorbed, for it to be used, and for, you know, Ukraine to strengthen its defense against these Russian, you know, attacks. And so as we come up to the NATO summit, I think the overall message is one of absolute unity and strength and support for Ukraine. But unfortunately, that could coexist alongside, you know, difficult days on the battlefield where Ukraine is under pressure, because it will take time to reverse that. I mean, I think steady progress has been made toward that, but, you know, that's the world that we're in. Nowhere, I think, is that more critical than on air defense. And I think that's something we, and I think everyone on this stage, has been warning about for some time, because, again, as you know, with air defense, you know, it's absolutely critical that we have the number of interceptors and radar and everything that allows it to be effective, so those systems are also maintained, right? And the risk of not getting support to Ukraine and not getting the supplemental at all was that Russia would end up being able to destroy those systems and then gain air superiority, which is something it has not had in this conflict to date, thankfully. And so we are working sort of every day, I know everyone on this stage, is to get as much sort of air defense, all the different components of that layered system, you know, over to Ukraine as fast as possible. I don't have anything sort of new to sort of announce in that, particularly in response to your question, except that, you know, I think it is, if not our very top, this one of the very top sort of priorities that we have. And I think everybody, you know, understands the incredible importance of that aspect of Ukraine's defense.
I will take one from the iPad, but still time for you guys to ask questions if you'd like. This one is not signed, but I thought it was interesting. If Russia and China are learning any lessons from Ukraine, one likely has to do with the risks that come with kinematic attacks and the value that comes from assaults in the first hybrid domain. NATO and its allies on the eastern flank experience Russian aggression acutely and are already grappling with a range of hybrid attacks. Is NATO prepared to address threats in the hybrid domain? And what might allies and partners do to increase the alliance's ability to deal with threats below the threshold? I don't know if any of you want to jump in.
So I think this is definitely the frontier and the area where we need to focus a lot of our efforts. I think you're right that particularly the states in the east of the NATO alliance have been grappling with cyber attacks from sources from outside NATO for some time now, and have started to establish quite strong capability in dealing with that. I think we need to continue to invest in that. I think in particular, you know, we need to continue to look at NATO doctrine and the way that cyber features in the doctrine and the way we think about the response to cyber. But I will say this, Ukraine has led the way in showing how you respond to Russian cyber aggression. And again, it did it because it had extraordinary partnership from the private sector who were willing to really lean in and help Ukraine. The way that Ukraine has moved its own tech capability into the cloud and learned to defend it there, and also the way they use cyber, not just in terms of protecting and defending their domestic digital capability, but also enhancing their warfighting capability is really, really impressive.
I'm going to take the moderator's liberty and toss in one of my own that I forgot to ask, but there was a good Atlantic Council paper I sorry, the author's name is escaping me at the moment, but suggesting that it's very likely that Putin would launch a new offensive around the time of the summit. Maybe we can start with one of the Americans on the panel, but I wonder how you're thinking about this risk and what, if anything, you can do about it as you're making preparations.
So we're already seeing it, right? Yeah. The Russians have launched a major assault on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, and they're hitting it now. They're sort of they counted on that gap between the end of major funding and our ability to push through with supplemental funding from the United States. So they've exploited that moment. We can expect that there will be some of those effects becoming more starkly visible as we head into the winter. We don't fully see it now because we're, it's happy spring and summertime weather, but it's going to get bad. So I think we should be prepared for that. In response to that and in anticipation of further attacks, this is where it goes back to another question that you asked about air defense. We are looking again. We're asking all allies and partners to take another look to see what we have in terms of interceptors, launchers, radars, anything else that can be repurposed, adjusted, to fit the urgent need for air defense. And at the same time, we have these capability coalitions, one of which is for the F-16s. And that capability should be coming online soon.
Anything to add about the prospect of a more major Russian offensive as the summit approaches?
One thing, I think what I said a moment ago, it's relevant here, but I think, it's incredibly important that we help Ukraine this year be able to defend its lines. And that is not the same as sort of saying that we wanted to settle for the status quo, or that, it should sort of just dig in and sort of take the assault from Russia. What it's saying is that this is going to take some time, that right now, because of its munitions advantage, because of what we've seen over the last 6 months, Russia feels in a position to be able to do this, and that it's incredibly important that Ukraine can hold the line and can prevent Russia from making those gains, and also impose a heavy cost on Russia as it tries to do that. That is a prerequisite for then Ukraine subsequently being able to retake territory or put enough pressure on Russia that Putin is actually willing to negotiate for real and withdraw from territory. So this year, especially the next few months, I think it's, that all of that is sort of critically important.
Okay, this one is from Ira Strauss, Senior Advisor at the Scowcroft Center. He said, won't our clever framing today, back to business, be insufficient for the July summit? It falls short because it implies back to the usual business. War is never business as usual. It's a crisis. A battle is either or, win-lose. Will the Washington summit be business as usual, or will heads of state and government arrive ready to do what it takes? How might we reframe this summit accordingly to correct this shortfall?
Well, I hope that none of the conversation we've had today sounds like business as usual, because it has not been business as usual since Putin invaded Ukraine, and it has not been business as usual for NATO as we have responded to that threat. So absolutely, this is a summit where we can rightly celebrate the period of peace that NATO has delivered, and the fact that NATO did deliver the end of the Cold War, but also rightly focus on the immediate threat now, which is defeating Putin in Ukraine. And just to track back to your last question, I think we shouldn't forget, as Ambassador Kim said, just how extraordinary Ukraine has been in standing up to this Russian aggression, just how extraordinary they were in repulsing the initial invasion, how extraordinary they were in retaking much of the territory that they lost in the initial phase. But we all need to think now, not just NATO and Ukraine's partners, but Ukraine themselves, about what they need to do over the coming period to make sure that they finish the job.
And I think we have time for one more question. So Make it count.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Luke Ignatz, and I'm an assistant director of the Transatlantic Security Initiative here at the Atlantic Council. I wanted to talk about some of the NATO partnerships, and in addition to Ukraine, you know, we have the situation in the Balkans that's quite complicated with increasing Russian posturing and messaging towards the region, and especially for you, Ambassador Kim, and you, Mr. Dittman, you've had quite a bit of experience in the region. What is your view on, are we doing enough to really ensure the security of the Western Balkans and engage with the leaders in a productive way in which not only NATO, but in general, the transatlantic relationship is sort of firmly anchored in the region and across the region? Thank you.
So clearly the big kahuna, so to speak, that we need to pay attention to right now is what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. At the same time, you know, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And what we also want to do is to pay attention to exactly what you say, countries that are not necessarily geographically, but in other ways on the periphery, right? The Balkans. We can see what the Russians are trying to do with their disinformation. You know, we've seen a couple of incidents now where it calls to mind, you know, an arsonist calling the police station to say that there's a fire about to start. So we see it. We also see what the Russians are trying to do in the South Caucasus. So in all of these areas, short answer to your question of, are we doing enough? I don't know that I'd phrase it that way, but we should certainly be very, very alert to what the Russians are attempting to do there.
Any last thoughts?
No, I think I agree that we cannot and are not losing sight of what's going on in the Western Balkans, who is moving much too slowly towards EU accession, but there's conditions that have to be met, but we really want to move that along. And we are, of course, also very much looking at the reaction and towards Russia, and calling that out and asking, really impressing for alignment with the EU positions. And on the immediate security thing, I can say that we have just increasing quite substantially also our presence with German soldiers in KFOR. So we take this also immediate security question serious.
Well, that is the end of our time. On behalf of the Atlantic Council, I would like to extend a special thanks to this all-star panel and the Lithuanian Ministry of Defense for their support of today's important event. And it has been an absolute pleasure. I hope everyone will stay engaged with the Atlantic Council in the lead up to the NATO Summit. And for any of you who will be there, look forward to seeing you there. And I will now turn it over to our MC for concluding remarks.
Felicia, and thank you to all of the panelists. Thank you, everybody, for attending and taking part in today's event. And of course, a special thank you to our friends and partners at the Ministry of National Defense of the Republic of Lithuania for their partnership and support for timely discussions like the ones we've had today. As we heard come up in the panel a few times, the next few months will be really crucial ones for the future of transatlantic security. And there will be busy ones for the Atlantic Council. Today's conference has been part of the Transatlantic Security Initiative's 2024 NATO Washington Summit campaign. So please do continue to stay engaged as we approach the summit, and follow us at AC Scowcroft on X, formerly Twitter, for more information and updates on future events. And with that, and until next time, thank you very much, and please give our panelists a round of applause.